There is a specific kind of quiet that only exists in the Blue Ridges of western North Carolina just before the first frost hits. It is the kind of silence where you can hear a dry pine needle drop from 40 feet up, striking the damp earth with a tiny distinct thud. I have spent 38 years of my life measuring that silence. When you spend almost 4 decades as a licensed land surveyor, you stop looking at the world in terms of scenery, and you start seeing it in lines, coordinates, and iron pins driven deep into the red clay. You learn that people will smile at you over a backyard fence for 20 years, but the moment they think your maple tree is 3 inches over their property line, their eyes change. They go sharp, they go greedy. I thought I had seen every variation of that look in my career, but I was wrong. The sharpest, greediest look I ever witnessed didn't come from a stranger or a difficult neighbor. It came from my younger brother Derek, on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 2:15 when he walked onto my porch, wearing shoes that cost more than my first truck. Welcome back to the channel, where we sit down and look at the hard truths of family, the weight of a father's responsibility, and the quiet ways justice finds its path when betrayal knocks on the front door. If you are new here, or if you have been listening to these stories for a while, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit with me. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. Now, back to the story, back to the day that the ground beneath my feet shifted though. Derek didn't know it yet. I am 65 years old now. My name is Harlan. For most of my life, people in and around Asheville knew me as the man you called when you wanted to know exactly where your world ended and someone else's began. It is slow work, surveying. It requires patience, an eye that doesn't blink at small discrepancies, and a deep respect for old documents. My father taught me that. When he passed away in 1991, he left me his 1978 brass surveyor's compass. It is heavy, scratched at the bottom near the level vial from a fall he took near Black Mountain, and the needle still settles due north with a reassuring mechanical click. I keep it on my desk next to my drafting table whenever I am working through a complex set of coordinates, or when I feel a variable starting to complicate a situation. I find myself reaching for my gold wedding ring, rubbing my thumb over the worn edge where the metal has thinned over 30 years. It is a habit, a quirk, I suppose. It keeps me grounded. It reminds me that things of value take time to forge and even longer to protect. Derek never understood that. He is 58, 7 years younger than me, and he spent his entire life running away from the dirt we were raised on. Our family estate consists of 64.8 contiguous acres of timberland nestled right in a valley near the Fountain City area, extending back into the rugged Carolina borderlines. Our grandfather bought it in 1942 for $8,500, cash money he earned by working double shifts at the rail yard, until his hands bled. To me, that land is a living history book. Every ridge has a story. Every old-growth oak is a marker of a winter we survived or a summer we celebrated. When my wife passed away 6 years ago, I walked those 64 acres every evening, listening to the crows and finding a strange, solid comfort in the fact that the earth doesn't change just because your heart breaks. But to Derek, land was never something you loved. To him, land was just a set of numbers waiting to be liquidated. He moved down to Charlotte 30 years ago, got into real estate development, and slowly transformed into a man who looked like he was assembled into a man who looked like he was assembled entirely from a corporate catalog. He wore the uniform, the linen shirts, the perfectly groomed silver hair, the smile that never quite reached his eyes. When he showed up at my house that Tuesday, he didn't call ahead. He just parked his pristine, midnight blue BMW in my gravel driveway, throwing up a cloud of dust that settled on my old 1998 Ford F-150. He stepped out, careful not to get his Italian loafers muddy, and looked around my porch with a look that fine is a word that sounds like a compliment, but isn't. He looked at my chipped paint, my stack of seasoned firewood, and my old hound dog sleeping by the door, and he sighed. It was the sigh of a man who thought he was visiting a museum of poverty. "Harlan," he said, extending a hand that had never held a chainsaw or a transit pole. "You're looking old, big brother." I didn't take his hand right away. I just finished rubbing my thumb over my ring, set my father's brass compass down on the wooden side table, and stood up. I am not a small man, and 40 years of carrying heavy equipment up steep ridges keeps your shoulders broad. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. Derek, I said, the driveway is for trucks. Yours is leaking oil on my gravel. He laughed, that fast, clever laugh of his. Cleverness is fast, you see. What I do is slow. He sat down on my wicker chair without being asked, pulling a thick leather portfolio from his briefcase. He didn't ask about my kids. He didn't ask about how my joints were holding up in the damp mountain air. He went straight to the point, because to men like Derek, time is money and sentiment is a liability. We need to talk about the homestead, Harlan, he said, opening the portfolio to reveal a set of glossy, high-resolution aerial maps. I've been approached by a group out of Atlanta, Vanguard Ridge Holdings. They're doing a luxury cabin development project. They want the whole 64 acres. They're offering $4.2 million, split right down the middle between you and me. $2.1 million each, Harlan. Think about that for a second. You could leave this damp valley, buy a condo in Florida, and never have to split another log for the rest of your life. I looked at the maps. They were beautiful the way certain storms are beautiful, crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of humanity. They had drawn little red lines over the creek where my daughters learned to swim. They had placed a symbol for a clubhouse, right where my mother's old garden used to be. Something in my stomach shifted. It was a familiar feeling, the same feeling I used to get when a property line didn't close properly on a map, a warning sign that someone was trying to hide a mistake. I didn't tell him what I was thinking. I went very, very quiet. If you know anything about me, you know that when I go quiet, it means I am measuring the distance between what a man is saying and what the truth actually is. The land isn't for sale, Derek, I said softly. I picked up my father's compass, feeling the cool weight of the brass against my palm. We agreed when Dad died that the property stays whole. The kids are supposed to inherit it. Derek's smile disappeared. His jaw did that thing. That slow, rhythmic grinding thing that he always did when he realized he wasn't going to get his way immediately. The kids, he sneered, his voice losing its polished corporate edge. Your kids are school teachers and mechanics, Harlan. They don't have the money to maintain a place like this. Taxes are going up. The roof on the old barn is rotting. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're acting like a stubborn old fool. I have a legal right to my half of this estate, and I am going to sell it, whether you like it or not. That was the first real red flag, not the threat itself, but the sheer confidence in his eyes. Derek wasn't a stupid man. He wouldn't have driven all the way up here just to get into a shouting match on my porch. He had a play. He had a card up his sleeve that he thought I didn't know about. But here is the thing about being a surveyor. You spend your whole life looking at what people think they own versus what the county records actually say. The next morning, at exactly 8:45, I walked into the law offices of Miller & Associates in downtown Asheville. The office smelled of old paper, stale tobacco, and expensive leather. Behind a massive oak desk sat Silas. Silas is 64 years old, has eyebrows like two overgrown briar patches, and has been my closest friend since we were rooming together at NC State. He is a title attorney, which means he doesn't do divorces or criminal defense. He spends his days digging through the subterranean archives of the courthouse, finding out who actually owns the dirt under our feet. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just pushed a cup of black lukewarm coffee toward the empty chair across from him. Your brother's lawyers filed a partition lawsuit yesterday afternoon, Silas said, his voice as dry as an autumn leaf. They're asking a judge to force the sale of the entire 64 acres because the land cannot be equitably split down the middle without destroying its value. He's trying to force your hand, Harlan. He thinks you can't afford to buy out his $2 million share, so the court will order an auction, and his Atlanta developers will buy the whole thing for pennies on the dollar. I sat down, took a sip of the terrible coffee, and didn't blink. I know, I said. He told me on the porch he was going to do it. Silas finally looked up, his sharp gray eyes drilling into mine. You don't look worried. You should be. A partition sale is hard to stop when one co-owner wants out. The law sides with liquidity, Harlan. If he wants his money, the court is going to give him a way to get it. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small yellowed piece of vellum paper from 1984, and laid it gently on his desk. It was an old survey map I had drawn myself, 32 years ago, long before the county digitized their records, back when everything was recorded in leather-bound deed books with fountain pens. "Look at the western boundary, Silas," I murmured. "Look at where the old logging road crosses the ridge to get to the main highway." Silas adjusted his glasses, leaning over the map. The silence sat like a fifth guest in the room as his fingers traced the faint black ink lines I had drawn 3 decades prior. I watched his face. I watched the way his eyebrows twitched, the way his hand froze on the table, and then, slowly, a very small, dangerous smile crept across his old face. "Harlan," Silas whispered, looking up at me, "tell me you didn't do what I think you did." "I mean that literally," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Every single inch of it. You see, Silas," I continued, "when our father was dividing up the surrounding parcels back in '84 to pay off the medical bills for our mother, Derek was already in college, demanding his tuition be paid. Dad sold the outer acreage to 3 different timber companies, but he kept the main 64 acres for us. What Derek forgot, or rather, what he never bothered to check because he thought it was just worthless scrub brush, was the legal description of the access corridors. When those timber companies folded in the 90s, I didn't buy the land back. I bought something much better. I bought the exclusive private right-of-way easements for every single access road, logging path, and dirt trail leading from the state highway into our family valley. I owned the dirt under the roads, Silas, all 3 of them, and according to the deed restrictions I placed on them in 1997, those roads are classified for personal residential use only, restricted to a maximum vehicle weight of 6,000 pounds. Silas let out a low whistle, shaking his head. 6,000 pounds. That means a standard pickup truck can get through, but a commercial excavator, a cement mixer, or a construction dump truck would be committing a civil trespass the moment their front tires clear the highway asphalt. I finished. Derek thinks he's selling a prime piece of luxury real estate to an Atlanta developer, but what he's actually trying to sell is a beautiful landlocked island surrounded by a moat that I completely control. Silas picked up his cold coffee, took a long gulp, and laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a quiet, rumbled sound in his chest. "He has no idea, does he?" "Not a clue," I said. "He's already planning his victory lap." I stood up, took my map back, and walked out into the crisp Asheville morning. The trap was set, but I wasn't going to spring it yet. You don't interrupt a man when he's making a mistake, especially when that man is your own blood, and he thinks he's smarter than the earth he came from. I drove back up the mountain, parked my truck, and sat on the porch for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley. The next few weeks played out exactly as Silas and I had anticipated. The legal machinery started turning, and Derek was doing everything he could to make the process as noisy and aggressive as possible. I started getting thick envelopes in the mail, sent via certified courier, filled with dense legalese from a downtown Charlotte firm. They were full of demands, deadlines, and thinly veiled threats about court-ordered appraisals and auction dates. I took every single one of those envelopes, walked into my kitchen, and dropped them into the cast-iron wood stove without opening them. I knew what was in them. They were the sound of a man trying to buy power with paperwork. I wasn't playing his game. I was playing mine, and mine was measured in coordinates, not commas. A month later, Derek showed up again. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought a parade. At 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the sound of heavy diesel engines echoed up through the valley. I was in the barn, rebuilding the carburetor on my old tractor when the noise started. I put down my wrench, wiped my hands on a grease rag, and walked out to the edge of the property line near the main entrance, the old logging road that fed directly from the state highway. There were 3 vehicles parked just off the asphalt. Derek's midnight blue BMW was in the lead, looking completely ridiculous out here among the pine needles and red dirt. Behind him was a massive, pristine Ford F-250 Super Duty, the kind with custom rims that had never seen a day of actual work in its life, sporting the logo of Vanguard Ridge Holdings on the door. And behind that was a flatbed trailer hauling a mid-sized Caterpillar excavator. Derek was out of his car, standing with two men in expensive khakis and clean Timberland boots. They were pointing at my grandfather's ridge, rolling out thick blueprints on the hood of the Ford, and nodding with the smug satisfaction of men who see dollar signs instead of trees. I didn't yell. I didn't march down there waving my arms. I just walked, slow and deliberate, taking my time to reach the edge of the driveway. When I got within 20 yards, Derek spotted me. His chest puffed out slightly, and he gave me that fast, clever smile again. "Morning, Harlan," he shouted, waving me over like I was a slightly dim-witted employee. "Come on down. I want you to meet the development team from Vanguard." I stopped at the edge of the gravel. I didn't cross the imaginary line that separated my private right-of-way from the public road. Our eyes met. "I don't need to meet them, Derek," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm not doing business with them." Derek's smile tightened, but he kept up the performance for his guests. "Harlan, this is Gary and Steve. We're just doing some preliminary purse tests on the soil. We need to know the drainage capacity for the clubhouse foundation before we finalize the partition sale next week. The judge is going to rule on Tuesday, and we want the excavators ready to move earth by Wednesday." One of the developers, the younger one named Steve, stepped forward, offering a hand. "Mr. Harlan, nice to meet you. We've heard a lot about your attachment to the land, but I promise you, Vanguard is going to build something beautiful here. Sustainable luxury, we call it." I looked at his outstretched hand. I didn't take it. I just looked back at Derek. "Per tests require heavy machinery," I said quietly. "That Caterpillar on the trailer weighs about 16,000 pounds. Give or take," Steve chuckled nervously, pulling his hand back. "We just need to get it up the ridge to dig a few test pits. Should take a few hours." "No," I said. Just the one word. It hung in the air, heavy and solid. Derek rolled his eyes and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "Harlan, stop being difficult. You can't stop us from driving on the access road. It's the only way into the property. The partition lawsuit gives us the right to inspect the asset. If you block us, my lawyers will have the sheriff out here in an hour with an injunction, and you'll be on the hook for our legal fees." He was so confident. He had rehearsed this speech in the mirror of his Charlotte penthouse, I guarantee it. He thought I was just a stubborn old man clinging to nostalgia, trying to use a rusty chain to stop a bullet train. I looked at the three men. I looked at the massive diesel engine rumbling on the trailer. And then I almost smiled. Almost. Which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle on a Thursday morning. "Derek," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, forcing him to lean in to hear me. "You don't need a sheriff. You need a surveyor. And I happen to be a very good one." I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't the original vellum map from Silas's office. It was a certified county-stamped copy of the deed restriction I had filed in 1997, highlighting the easement terms in bright, undeniable yellow marker. I didn't hand it to Derek. I handed it to Gary, the older developer, the one who actually looked like he read contracts before he signed them. "This is the sole access road to the 64 acres you are trying to buy," I said, addressing Gary directly. "As you can see, the property itself is jointly owned by my brother and me. However, the dirt you are standing on right now, the road that leads from the highway to the property line, is owned entirely by me. It is a private easement." Gary adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the highlighted text. His face, which had been ruddy and confident a moment ago, began to drain of color. "And as you will read in Section 4, Paragraph B," I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic, like a metronome, "that easement is strictly restricted to non-commercial residential use only. Furthermore, there is a hard, non-negotiable weight limit of 6,000 pounds for any vehicle crossing my land. Your Ford F-250 weighs about 7,000 pounds empty. That Caterpillar excavator on the trailer, 16,000. If either of those vehicles crosses this gravel line, it constitutes a commercial trespass, a violation of the easement, and I will have your equipment impounded before you reach the first bend in the road." Nobody said anything for a while. The silence had weight to it, The only sound was the low idle of the diesel truck. Gary looked up from the paper, his eyes darting from me to Derek. "Derek," he said, his voice completely devoid of its former friendliness. "Did you know about this?" Derek was staring at me, his jaw slack. The cleverness had vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. That's impossible," he stammered, stepping forward. "Dad left the access roads to both of us. It was part of the original estate." "No, Derek," I said gently. "Dad sold the outer parcels in '84 to pay for Mom's hospital bills. You were in college. You were too busy complaining about your allowance to notice. When the timber companies folded in the '90s, I bought the access rights back with my own money. I filed the deeds myself. I have owned the gates to this valley for 29 years. You can't enforce a weight limit," Derek yelled, his face flushing red. "It's a road. We have a legal right-of-way to access the property. You have a right-of-way to drive a passenger car up here." I corrected him. "You can walk up here. You can ride a bicycle up here, but you cannot bring a commercial development crew, heavy machinery, or construction materials across my land. Which means, gentlemen," I turned back to the developers, "you cannot build your luxury cabins. You cannot pour a foundation. You cannot lay a sewer line. My brother is trying to sell you a $4 million property that you cannot legally bring a single cement truck into." Gary handed the paper back to Derek, who snatched it like it was burning his fingers. Gary didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "Steve," he said to the younger developer, "tell the driver to turn the rig around. We're done here." Derek pleaded, stepping in front of the Ford. "I can fix this. We can get a judge to overturn the restriction. We can claim necessity." Gary stopped and looked at my brother with a cold, dead-eyed stare. "A judge isn't going to overturn a 30-year-old recorded easement just because you want to build a clubhouse, Derek. Vanguard doesn't buy litigation. We buy clean titles. You told us this property was clear. You lied. The deal is dead, and we expect our earnest money deposit returned by the end of business tomorrow." They got in the truck, reversed onto the highway, and drove away, leaving Derek standing in a cloud of diesel exhaust, clutching a piece of paper that had just cost him $2 million. He slowly turned to face me. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago. The expensive linen shirt suddenly looked like a costume he had outgrown. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shock. "You sat there on the porch and let me spend thousands of dollars in legal fees on a partition suit, knowing I couldn't sell it. I measured twice, Derek," I said, rubbing my thumb over my wedding ring. "I cut once. Now, please get your car off my road. It's leaking oil." Derek stood there in the gravel for a long time after the Vanguard truck disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the thick Carolina pines. The dust settled around his ankles, coating his expensive loafers in a fine layer of red clay. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a tantrum. He just stood completely still, his hands resting on his hips, staring at the empty space where his $4 million payday had just evaporated. His jaw was doing that thing. That slow, grinding thing. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. I turned my back to him, walked into the barn, and picked up my wrench. I went back to work on the carburetor of my old tractor. There is a deep mechanical satisfaction in fixing an engine the way every small brass jet and rubber gasket has a specific, undeniable purpose. You cannot negotiate with a machine. It either runs or it doesn't. People, on the other hand, are messy. They bend the rules, they lie to themselves, and they assume the world will bend with them. I could hear Derek's BMW start up outside, the engine revving a little too high, a little too angry. He threw it into reverse, the tires spinning and spitting gravel into the grass, before rocketing down the access road toward the highway. I wiped the grease off my hands with a shop towel and listened until the sound faded completely. The silence returned to the valley, sitting heavy and absolute. I didn't know it yet, but the real fight hadn't even started. Here is the thing about men who build their entire identities on the appearance of wealth. They are almost always standing on the edge of a cliff, completely blindfolded. The next morning, the mountain air was sharp and damp. I was on the porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, when my cell phone rang. It was Silas. I answered. putting him on speaker while I watched a pair of hawks circle the ridge. I pulled the financial filings on Vanguard Ridge Holdings, Silas said, his voice crackling slightly over the terrible cell reception in the valley. No hello, no small talk, just the business of dirt and paper. And then I did a little digging into your brother's LLC down in Charlotte. You want the bad news or the worst news? Just give me the numbers, Silas, I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. He is drowning, Harlan, Silas replied, the amusement completely gone from his voice. Vanguard didn't just sign an intent to purchase. They gave Derek a $250,000 earnest money deposit 3 months ago. A non-refundable deposit, contingent on a clear title and unencumbered access to the site. I set my mug down on the wooden railing. And the money? Gone, Silas said bluntly. He transferred it into his personal accounts the next day. From what I can tell looking at the public liens against his other properties, he used it to pay off a margin call on a commercial development in Raleigh that went sideways last year. He didn't just want to sell the family estate, Harlan. He needed to sell it to keep himself out of bankruptcy. Now that Vanguard has pulled out, he is in breach of contract. They are going to demand that $250,000 back by the end of the week, and if he doesn't have it, they will sue him into the Stone Age. I went very, very quiet. I rubbed my thumb over my wedding ring, feeling the worn metal. Desperation makes smart men do very stupid things, Silas. Which is why you need to be careful, Silas warned. I know Derek. You know Derek. He is not going to just walk away and file for Chapter 11. He's cornered. He's going to look for a way to force the sale, or worse, find a way to make you pay for his mistake. Over the next 48 hours, the desperation became a loud thing. It started with the voicemails. 6 of them, left in rapid succession between Thursday night and Friday morning. I sat at my kitchen table, eating a bowl of oatmeal, and listened to them play out in the quiet room. The first one was conciliatory, almost begging. Harlan, come on, man. We're brothers. We can work this out. I can get Vanguard to compromise on a smaller footprint. The third one was erratic. You have no right to do this. You're stealing from my children, Harlan. You're a bitter old man sitting on a pile of dirt. The sixth one, left at exactly 2:11 in the morning, was terrifyingly calm. I'm not losing everything because of your stubbornness, Harlan. I have options. You don't own the world. I'll see you soon. I didn't reply to any of them. I deleted them, washed my bowl, and went out to the barn to get my gear. If Derek thought he was going to intimidate me out of a 30-year-old deed restriction, he fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. I spent my entire career walking through thorny brush, arguing with aggressive landowners, and finding the exact truth hidden in the dirt. I packed my truck with a machete, a can of orange marking paint, a sledgehammer, and my father's brass compass. I drove down to the western boundary line, right where my private easement met the public highway. When I arrived, my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. The heavy steel gate I had installed 10 years ago, the one that blocked the old logging road, was hanging open, but it hadn't been unlocked. The heavy iron padlock had been cleanly cut with a pair of industrial bolt cutters. The two halves of the lock were lying in the mud like discarded teeth. I stepped out of the truck, the cool morning air suddenly feeling thick in my lungs. I walked over to the gate and knelt down. The tire tracks in the mud were fresh. They were wide, deep treads. A heavy-duty truck. But it wasn't just a truck. I stood up and followed the tracks about 50 yards into the tree line. My eyes scanned the underbrush, looking for the familiar orange caps of the rebar property pins I had driven into the ground 3 decades ago. I knew exactly where they were supposed to be. I knew the coordinates by heart, but when I reached the first marker point, near the old oak tree, the ground was disturbed. A fresh, jagged hole sat in the earth. The iron pin had been completely ripped out of the ground. I kept walking. The second pin was gone. The third pin, located near the creek bed, was also gone. Somebody had come onto my land in the middle of the night, cut my gate, and systematically uprooted the legal survey markers that defined my easement. In the state of North Carolina, removing or tampering with an established land survey monument is a Class 1 misdemeanor. It is a direct assault on the legal boundaries of a property. Derek was trying to erase the lines. He thought that if the physical markers were gone, he could argue in court that the easement was poorly defined, abandoned, or legally ambiguous. I almost laughed. I almost smiled. Almost. He was trying to out-survey a surveyor. I pulled out my phone and took clear time-stamped photographs of the cut lock, the tire tracks, and the empty holes where the pins used to be. Every piece of evidence was meticulously documented. Then, I set my father's compass on a flat rock, letting the needle settle with that familiar mechanical click, and began pulling measurements from the witness trees to re-establish the exact points of the missing pins. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow. And I was going to bury him with coordinates. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. I spent 6 hours in the woods, spray painting the trees, and driving new, temporary wooden stakes into the ground. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long, dark shadows across the valley. My joints ached, and my boots were heavy with mud. I drove back up to the house, exhausted but satisfied. I had the evidence. I had the upper hand. But as I pulled into my driveway, the satisfaction vanished. There was a white envelope taped to my front door. It wasn't sent through the mail. It had been placed there by hand. I parked the truck, walked up the steps, and pulled the envelope down. My name was written on the front in Derek's neat, expensive handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a legal filing from the county clerk's office, stamped and dated that very afternoon. I read the first paragraph, and the blood drained from my face. My hand was shaking. I sat in my truck for a while, staring at the words until they blurred. He hadn't just removed the pins to blur the lines. That was a distraction. While I was out in the woods playing surveyor, Derek had gone to a judge. The document was an emergency order of condemnation. He had somehow convinced the local municipality that my private road was an essential utility corridor for a proposed public water line, effectively petitioning the county to seize my easement under eminent domain. And the signature endorsing the municipal petition belonged to none other than the county commissioner. I didn't know how much Derek had paid them, or what lies he had spun, but the message was clear. If he couldn't buy the road, and he couldn't cross the road, he was going to have the government steal it from me. I sat in the cab of my truck for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled down. The white envelope, feeling like a lead weight in my lap, an emergency order of condemnation, eminent domain, the government's ultimate trump card. It is the legal equivalent of a bulldozer, designed to flatten any private property rights in the name of public necessity. Derek had actually found a judge and a county commissioner willing to sign off on a fabricated utility crisis just to seize my access road and pave the way for his luxury cabins. It was a bold move. It was also the most arrogant, desperate mistake he could have possibly made. I didn't panic. I didn't drive down to Charlotte and throw a brick through his office window. I went very, very quiet. I pulled out my phone and dialed Silas. He answered on the second ring, the sound of ice clinking and a glass echoing through the receiver. They filed a condemnation order, I said, my voice perfectly level. Signed by Commissioner Vance. They're claiming the road is a critical corridor for a municipal water line extension. Silas didn't say anything for a full 10 seconds. I could hear his mind working, shifting through 30 years of case law and local politics. Vance, Silas finally muttered, his voice dripping with disgust. That makes sense. Vance is up for re-election in 8 months, and his campaign fund is running dry. Derek must have promised him a massive kickback from the Vanguard deal. But an emergency order, that requires a health and safety crisis. They can't just seize a private driveway for a hypothetical cabin resort. They can if they lie on the engineering reports, I replied, staring out at the darkening tree line, and Derek brought out his own developers. He probably had their engineers draft a bogus environmental impact study saying the current county water lines are failing and my valley is the only viable bypass. They want to start digging by Monday. Harlan, listen to me, Silas said, the casual tone completely gone. If this gets rubber-stamped in court on Monday morning, they will have sheriff's deputies out there cutting your fences by noon. The county has infinite resources. We need to file a temporary restraining order immediately. No, I said softly. I looked down at my thumb, rubbing the worn edge of my wedding ring. We aren't filing a restraining order, Silas. We are going to let them come. Are you out of your mind? You're playing with dynamite. Harlan. I am a surveyor, Silas. I reminded him, I don't play with dynamite. I measure the blast radius. Meet me at your office tomorrow at 6 in the morning. We have some archives to dig through. I spent the entire weekend with Silas in the basement of the county courthouse and his dusty office pulling microfiche records, federal topography maps, and state conservation registries. We drank terrible, cold coffee and didn't speak unless it was absolutely necessary. By Sunday night, my eyes were burning. But we had everything we needed, stacked neatly in a single manila folder. I drove back up the mountain, went to sleep, and woke up at dawn. I put on my work boots, poured a cup of coffee, and walked out to the porch to wait. They arrived at exactly 9:15 on Monday morning. The convoy was smaller this time, but far more official. A silver 2022 Chevy Tahoe with municipal plates led the way, followed by Derek's BMW N. Finally, a marked county sheriff's cruiser. They parked at the edge of the gravel, right where the gate used to be. Derek stepped out first, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, his chin held high. He looked like a man who had just won a war he never actually fought. Behind him emerged Commissioner Vance, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a flushed face and a tie that was knotted too tight. The deputy stayed by his cruiser, looking distinctly uncomfortable. They walked up the long gravel driveway toward my porch. I didn't stand up. I stayed in my wicker chair, my father's brass compass resting on the table next to my coffee mug. "Morning, Harlan," Derek called out, his voice practically vibrating with triumph. "I told you I had options. The stubborn act ends today." Commissioner Vance stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of papers from his leather folio. He didn't look me in the eye. Politicians rarely do when they know they are stealing from you. "Mr. Harlan," Vance said, his voice carrying that fake, rehearsed authority, "I am serving you with a final order of condemnation, effective immediately. The county is seizing the access easement under eminent domain to establish a critical water utility corridor. You will be compensated at fair market value for the dirt, which our appraisers have determined to be approximately $12,000. You have 24 hours to remove any personal property from the roadway before the excavation crews arrive." He held the papers out. I didn't take them. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let the mug rest on my knee, and looked at Derek. His jaw was relaxed. He was practically glowing. $12,000, I repeated, quietly, for a road that gives access to a $4 million property. That is a hell of a discount you arranged for Vanguard, Derek. It's the law, Harlan, Derek sneered, taking a step closer. You tried to lock me out of my own inheritance. You thought you were so clever with your little deed restrictions, but you forgot that the county has the final say over infrastructure. Now step aside, or the deputy is going to arrest you for interfering with a municipal project. I looked at the deputy. He shifted his weight, refusing to make eye contact with me. I looked back at Vance. "Commissioner," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I held up one hand. Just one. "Before you finalize that paperwork and send your crews up here, I have a professional question for you. Who conducted the environmental land survey for this proposed water line?" Vance frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay. Vanguard's engineering team submitted a comprehensive topography report to the county planning board. It was fully approved. "I see," I said, leaning forward. "Did Vanguard's engineers happen to notice the small creek that runs parallel to the entire length of the road?" "It's a drainage ditch," Derek interrupted impatiently. "It's irrelevant. It is a perennial stream," I corrected him gently. "And here is the thing about perennial streams in this part of the state, Derek. They feed directly into the French Broad River Basin." I picked up the manila folder from the table and tossed it onto the porch. It landed with a heavy, satisfying slap against the wood. "I am a retired land surveyor, Commissioner, which means I don't rely on developers to tell me what the dirt does. In 1997, when I bought the access rights to this road, I didn't just file a weight restriction. I conducted a full riparian survey of that creek. I mapped the exact high water mark, the floodplain, and the erosion corridors. Vance's face began to lose its color. His eyes darted down to the folder. What are you talking about? I am talking about the fact that in 1998, I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic. I legally donated the development rights of a 50-foot buffer zone on either side of that creek to the North Carolina Clean Water Management Trust Fund. It is a recorded, federally recognized conservation easement. That means the land you are currently standing on is protected by state and federal environmental law as a critical watershed buffer. The silence on the porch was absolute. The wind stopped rustling the pines. You could hear a pin drop. I have, Vance stammered, looking at Derek in blind panic. You told me this was a simple private easement. You didn't say anything about a state conservation trust. He didn't know, I said, smiling for the first time that morning. It wasn't a kind smile, because he doesn't read the history of the land. He tries to sell. He just looks at the price tag. I stood up, towering over them, on the porch stairs. The county cannot use eminent domain to seize state-protected conservation land for a local utility without a federal environmental impact study, a public hearing, and the direct approval of the state attorney general. If you put a single shovel into that dirt tomorrow, Commissioner, you won't be dealing with an angry old man. You will be dealing with the federal government prosecuting you for the destruction of a protected watershed. Derek's face was chalk white. You're lying. You can't just donate a road to the state. I didn't donate the road, Derek. I donated the development rights to the buffer. The road is just sitting inside it. I reached into the folder and pulled out one final piece of paper. But that isn't the best part. The best part is what Silas found when he started pulling the campaign finance records for your upcoming re-election, Commissioner. I handed Vance the paper. It was a printed ledger, a $15,000 consulting fee, paid by a Charlotte LLC, owned by my brother, transferred directly to an administrative shell company, managed by your campaign manager, dated exactly 2 days before you signed this emergency condemnation order. Vance's hand began to shake violently. The paper rattled in his grip. Now, I said, stepping down until I was exactly eye level with the commissioner. I can take this ledger, along with your illegal condemnation order, and hand it to the State Ethics Commission by lunchtime. You will be indicted for bribery, fraud, and abuse of power before the end of the month. Or you can tear up that order, get off my property, and never speak to my brother again. Commissioner Vance didn't hesitate. He didn't look at Derek. He simply ripped the condemnation order in half, then in quarters, shoving the pieces into his suit pocket. He turned on his heel, walked back to his Tahoe, and drove away without a backward glance. The deputy, realizing the situation had completely imploded, tipped his hat to me and slowly backed his cruiser out of the driveway, which left only Derek, standing alone in the gravel, completely exposed. Derek stood in the gravel. The dust from the commissioner's Tahoe had already settled, but Derek hadn't moved an inch. He looked down at his Italian loafers, coated in the red clay of the driveway he had tried to steal, and then he looked up at me. The polished corporate catalog version of my brother was gone. His shoulders slumped, the crisp lines of his charcoal suit suddenly looking wrinkled and hollow. He didn't look like a high-powered Charlotte real estate developer anymore. He looked exactly like the scared 12-year-old boy who used to break our father's tools and then lie about it to avoid a whipping. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. There is no joy in watching a man realize that he has built his entire life on a foundation of sand, especially when that man shares your last name. I walked down the steps of the porch, the gravel crunching under my work boots, and stopped a few feet away from him. "They're going to sue me, Harlan," he said. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was thin, reedy, and vibrating with panic. "Vanguard, when they find out the condemnation failed, they are going to demand their $250,000 back. And I don't have it. I spent it. My business accounts are completely overdrawn. They'll pierce the corporate veil. They'll take my house in Myers Park. They'll take everything." I looked at him. I looked at the dark bags under his eyes that I hadn't noticed before, the slight tremor in his hands. "I know, Derek," I said quietly. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between us, as if he expected me to grab it and pull him back from the edge of the cliff. "You can buy me out," he pleaded, the desperation stripping away whatever pride he had left. "You have the money saved up. I know you do. You've been living out here with no mortgage for 30 years. Pay me for my half of the estate right now. Just $250,000, just enough to pay Vanguard back. You can keep the whole 64 acres. Just write me a check, Harlan. Please, we're blood." Something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. It was a heavy, sinking feeling, the realization that he still didn't understand. Even now, standing in the ruins of his own arrogance, he thought money was the only tool that could fix a broken thing. He thought he could just buy his way out of the consequences. "Here is the thing about consequences, Derek," I said, my voice steady, though my throat felt tight. "They don't negotiate, and they don't take a buyout. You're my brother," he yelled, his voice cracking, echoing off the ridge. "You're just going to stand there and watch me lose everything." "I am," I said softly, "because if I write you that check, I am paying you for trying to destroy our family's legacy. I am paying you for cutting my locks, uprooting my survey pins, and bribing a corrupt politician to steal my land. You didn't care that you were my brother when you left those voicemails at 2:11 in the morning threatening me. You only remembered we were blood when you ran out of cards to play." I rubbed my thumb over my wedding ring, feeling the cold morning air settling over the valley. "I love you, Derek. I always have. But I cannot pay for the lessons you refuse to learn." His hand dropped to his side. He stared at me for a long time, searching my face for a bluff, for a crack in the stone. He didn't find one, because there wasn't one. He finally turned around, walked to his midnight blue BMW V, and got in. He didn't spin the tires this time. He didn't rev the engine. He just slowly backed out onto the highway and drove away. The fallout over the next 6 months was methodical, brutal, and entirely public. Silas called me every few weeks with updates, usually while we were both drinking cold, terrible coffee on opposite ends of a phone line. Vanguard Ridge Holdings did exactly what they promised. When Derek couldn't produce the earnest money, they filed a massive breach of contract lawsuit in Mecklenburg County. The discovery phase alone financially ruined him. They found the commingled funds, the desperate transfers to cover his Raleigh margin calls, and the trail of unpaid contractors on his other projects. By November, Derek's LLC had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He lost the house in Myers Park. He lost the cars. And because a federal bankruptcy trustee was appointed to liquidate his assets, his 50% stake in our family estate was put on the auction block to pay off his creditors. I didn't have to fight him for it anymore. I didn't have to worry about partition lawsuits or corrupt commissioners. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I walked into the county courthouse with Silas, carrying a cashier's check for exactly $85,412. That was the assessed fair market value of a 50% stake in a completely landlocked parcel of timberland that no developer could legally access. I bought my brother's half of the estate from the bankruptcy court for pennies on the dollar, paying exactly what the dirt was worth when you stripped away the illusion of luxury cabins and country clubs. The title is clear now. The 64.8 acres are held in an irrevocable family trust, with my daughters listed as the sole beneficiaries. No one can ever force a sale again. No one can ever bring an excavator across the creek. The land is safe, but victory is a strange thing. People think it feels like a parade, but it doesn't. Sometimes it just feels like an empty driveway. I haven't spoken to Derek since that morning he drove away. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he moved into a small apartment in Greensboro, managing a strip mall for a property management firm. I sent him a Christmas card last year. He didn't send one back. Some days I wonder if I did the right thing. I wonder if I should have just written him the check to save him from the humiliation, to preserve whatever fragile thread of brotherhood we had left. It is a heavy thing to hold the power to save someone and choose not to use it. But then I walk the property line. I walk down to the creek bed, past the old oak tree, and I see the exact spot where he pulled my iron pins out of the earth. I look at the water flowing into the French Broad River, clean and untouched. Most days I know I did the right thing. That has to be enough. You can't survey a man's character. You can't put a transit pole in the ground and measure where his greed ends and his conscience begins. You can only draw your own lines, set your own boundaries, and stand firm when the storms come. I spent my life making sure the lines on the map matched the reality of the dirt. I did the same thing with my family. The reality is that the land will outlast us all. It doesn't care about our bank accounts, our lawsuits, or our broken hearts. It just remains. The sun is setting now over the Blue Ridges. The November wind is starting to pick up, shaking the dry pine needles loose, letting them fall to the damp earth with that tiny distinct thud. I walk back up to the porch, my boots heavy with the day's work. I stop by the small wooden table. I pick up my father's 1978 brass compass. It is cold to the touch, heavy and scarred at the bottom near the level vial. I unlatch the cover, hold it flat in my palm, and watch the needle swing back and forth for a moment before settling. It clicks mechanically, pointing due north, right toward the heart of the valley. Steady, unchanging. Exactly where it is supposed to be.